Chapter 1. Look, I didn't just wake up one day and decide to turn into a man. Well, I did, but first, I got to watch the possibilities of my actual self's future narrow and wink out like a candle in a draft. I became the whole tangled mess on Dr. Savo, a pompous, fusty horror of a human being, with his gray hair and his tweed suit and his unassailable credibility as a tenured classics professor at Everly University. Most of my life I wanted to become him, the more elegant female version, maybe with a Chanel suit and cat-eye glasses. And of course I wasn't angling to be a fascist asshole when I grew up. I guess what I really wanted was his job. I wanted to be the one who opened the doors to the past, who got paid in status and money to puzzle together a picture of ancient societies from sherds and other enigmas hidden in the earth. My interview with Dr. Savo for the Pendlebury Fellowship was held on Friday, October 16, 1953. I remember because my mind latches onto dates and time, but even if I'd forgotten, there is an entry in my agenda. It's a lovely leather-bound 5-year agenda. My gift for being the Billings High School valedictorian of the class of 1951. Embossed in gold letters on the front, the name I would come to abandon, Cleo Thessalonika Hart. Hart, from my father's father, an Irish immigrant from Kerry. Thessalonika, a piece of my Greek paternal grandmother's homeland grafted onto myself. And Cleo, a name stolen from the muse of history and gifted to me by my dad before he got himself blown up over the Pacific in the Battle of Midway. The Savo incident shows up near the halfway point of the agenda. The preceding chronicled my first 2 years at Everly. Sailing practices, photography assignments for the Everly Gazette, campus dances, football games, evening jaunts into the town of Iona to hear jazz at the Crown, Sunday mornings at the library, classes, exams, and papers crowded my freshman and sophomore years. Leave it to the aspiring archaeologist to create curated documentary evidence of her own life. I first heard about the Pendlebury Fellowship a few weeks before, Tuesday, October 6th, to be exact, the entry made in pencil and marked with a star, when Dr. Reynolds pontificated about it in classical Civ. Imagine it! To be the first living person to see and touch the treasures of the Minoan Sea Kings, to bring into the light artifacts of a civilization buried for 6 millennia. At Everly University, that bastion of higher learning nestled in the idols of upstate New York, female students were few and far between, only about 20% of the student body. And almost all seemed to agree that Dr. Reynolds was the dreamiest professor. Never mind that he was balding, well into middle age, and married with children. Many a freshman found themselves in introductory Greek by way of his charm. I never quite understood the appeal. I admit that Dr. Reynolds was less soft around the edges than his peers, and he certainly wasn't boring. He had a tendency to work himself into such intense passions during his lectures that he'd fling off his jacket and sweat through his shirt. But while I didn't find myself attracted to Dr. Reynolds the person, I was uncommonly susceptible to his ability to make the object of his interests seem attractive. He laid it on especially thick when he told us about the fellowship. The clear blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea, the white mountains of Crete, the legendary birthplace of Zeus himself. Zeus! The opportunity to walk in the footsteps of more recent giants like Sir Arthur Everett, the original excavator of the Palace of Knossos. To give homage to your work with John Pendlebury, a scholar executed by Germans during the Battle of Crete in World War II. Believe me when I say, you are lucky to have the chance. Dr. Reynolds paused for effect and to swab his face with a handkerchief. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. I had to lean forward to hear him. Do you want to be a mere academic who lives his life between the walls of a university and the pages of a book? I didn't. I mean, that's exactly what I'd wanted about 10 minutes earlier. I thought that was all there was. Or do you want to be the person who excavates? Do you want to be an archaeologist? I had never wanted anything more. I spent the week after Dr. Reynolds' performance working on the personal statement for my application. I handed over draft after draft to my roommate Vi for editing. Vi was a staff writer for the Everly Gazette. I trusted her judgment on all things made of words. With the benefit of her guidance, my personal statement grew beyond my level of comfort and became actually personal. For the first time in my life, I wrote about the day a man in uniform knocked on my door and delivered the telegram that told us that Dad burned to death in the air. One minute, Mom was gently cursing into a pot of stew as she scraped bits of Victory Garden potato from the bottom of the pan. The next, she was howling into her apron on the steps of the stairs. Collapsed, but still moving, like a shot deer running through the trees, leaving a trail of its own steaming blood on the snowy forest floor. My personal statement wasn't just a sob story, though. There were happy bits, too. Anecdotes about the bedtime folk tales my father told me. Myths that Yaya Sophia had told him as a little boy. An actual quote from the conclusion, "If you sliced open my veins, you'd find salt water from the Mediterranean and the words of Homer." Dr. Reynolds wasn't the only one who could lay it on thick. The vulnerability of writing myself onto a page was not something I undertook willingly, but the process of doing it opened up something in me. I started dreaming about Greece again. Images of a wine-dark sea under sprays of stars swept me through the liminal state between waking and sleeping. In the morning, I felt as though I'd spent my night as a Minoan, living at the mercy of the waves of a faraway world. Long after Vi's editorial patience had run out, but still 1 week before the deadline, I sent my application to Dr. Savo for consideration. Next classical civ class, Dr. Reynolds held me back to tell me that Dr. Savo had requested an interview with me about the Pendlebury Fellowship. Did anyone else get an interview? I couldn't keep the excitement out of my voice. Dr. Reynolds looked down at his podium and straightened a stack of papers. Not as far as I know. Oh. My entire body flushed with the warmth of gratification and hope. If I were you, Miss Hart, I would prepare myself. Don't worry, Dr. Reynolds. I'll be prepared. The morning of the 16th found me hard at work preparing by disturbing the peace in the common room of William's women's residence with my Underwood. That typewriter must have been 20 years old already when I'd commandeered it from my father's library back in Iowa. Heavy enough to be a murder weapon, loud enough to be a distress signal. Vi had draped herself over an armchair with a fashion magazine. Outside, the old oak tree flounced against a cloudless blue sky. The leaves were in a state of transition, half green, half crimson. All female students at Everly were required to live in Williams. There were no sororities, and off-campus housing was forbidden. The women of Everly worked and gossiped and congregated in the common room. We took our meals in the attached dining area, where our house mother, Ms. Prudell, a.k.a. Ms. Prude, presided over the stews and casseroles. In Williams, we were expected to live and eat and study without the distraction of rubbing elbows with the gentlemen students. Heavens save us, she's at it again. Marcy Danforth had come into the room, and when Marcy came into the room, it was an event. She swanned around like a film star, every movement staged as if all eyes were on her. To be fair, they usually were. Vi's own pair of blue eyes peeked over the top of her magazine to clock what Marcy was wearing, a tweed eau de Nil tailored jacket and matching skirt. Schoolwork on a Friday afternoon. Marcy made that sound with her mouth that I'd always hated. Cleo, don't you know there's life happening out there? Tailgating for the game has already started. The haughty insincerity of her transatlantic accent suited Marcy just as much as the pillbox hat perched on her bottle-blonde head. I stopped typing. I'd been working on my notes for my interview, parts of my application and portfolio that I wanted to be sure to highlight, my 4.0 GPA, my fluency in modern Greek, maybe a charming anecdote or two from my summers staying with Thea Annilee in the heart of New York City's Greek community. I'd even submitted a portfolio of photographs I'd taken for the Everly Gazette, alongside my academic portfolio of translations from Ovid's Metamorphosis and Homer's Odyssey. And of course, I wanted to be sure to emphasize the fact that I was the recipient of the Bernard Haverford Memorial Scholarship for Excellence in Classics, the only reason I was able to attend a university like Everly to begin with. This is my life, I said. I took my notes out of the typewriter and handed them to Vi to look over. Vi skimmed the sheet. Come to think of it, it was a bit strange that Dr. Savo had asked to interview me on a Friday game day, but I wasn't going to tell Marcy that. "They'd be idiots not to select you," Vi said. "Loyal to the bitter end, huh, MacArthur?" I checked to make sure the ink wouldn't smudge, then I folded my notes into a small square and slid it into the pocket of my cardigan. Marcy rolled her coal-lined eyes. "Ugh, you two." She set a parcel on the table. "Vi, look! This just came back from my tailor in the city." Marcy untied the string, and yards of lavender silk spilt out. "I ordered it for the mixer at the Epsilons tonight. What do you think?" She held the dress to her shoulders and spun around. The fabric rippled like water. Vi was on her feet. "Marcy, it's beautiful!" She ran one finger across the lace collar. "What will you wear it with? You know those silver heels, the ones I wore to homecoming? And pearls." She brought her fingertips to the string that was already around her neck. "Ash bought you those, didn't he?" Vi said and elbowed her. "Ugh, you too," I said. "Jealous, Cleo?" Marcy asked and gingerly set her dress back in the package. I laughed. "Not my style, the dress or the boy." Marcy wrinkled her nose. "You couldn't afford either one." My face went hot. I stood up from the desk. "Ugh, you two!" Vi linked her arm through mine. "Cleo, we're going to the mixer too, remember?" I lifted an eyebrow at her. Vi hated conflict of any kind. If I slapped Marcy across the face, it would be like slapping Vi. "Don't look at me like that," she said. "Of course we're going. They booked the swinging maze band. Think of the dancing, Cleo!" I smiled. "Besides, I told Bertie I'd be there." "Well, then, I guess we're going," I said. "But first, if you don't mind," I waved a sheet of typing paper in Marcy's general direction. She narrowed her eyes. "You can't kick me out, Cleo Hart. This is the common room, a place for all." "Your new dress is getting wrinkled," I said. Marcy gasped. When she was gone, I let out a long, beleaguered sigh. "What a terror she is," I said. "Oh, come on, Cleo. If you weren't at each other's throats all the time, I think you could be friends." I snorted. I can't think of anything less likely. Dr. Savo's office was in the Radcliffe Building of Classical Studies in the original part of campus. Old Augustus Everley, the minister who founded the place in the late 1600s, had built it up on a hill south of Lake Manlius. The small town of Iona stretched down in the space between the university and the lake. As Main Street dipped towards the shore, the houses became shabbier and the commerce seedier. In Iona, higher social classes were literally at a higher elevation. Everyone seemed to be outside. As I walked uphill to Radcliffe, the rest of the world headed in the opposite direction towards the football field. The campus was washed in the green and white Everley colors. In the distance, the band was playing the fight song. I got to Radcliffe 15 minutes early, enough time to check my appearance in the bathroom on the first floor. I'd buttoned every single button on my ironed and starched white cotton blouse and my hunter green V-neck wool cardigan. No jewelry, just the gold-embroidered Everley insignia over my left breast. A black wool skirt fell to my knees, and my legs were covered in white wool stockings. Earlier that morning, I'd shined up my Oxfords. Every requirement of the Everley female dress code met and checked off. I powdered my nose and smoothed back a few hairs that had escaped from pins. Dirty blonde hair worn long past my shoulders and pulled back from my face. My summer freckles were starting to fade, but they were still there, peppering my nose and cheeks. I skipped up the stairs to the second floor and knocked on Dr. Savo's office. At that point, I didn't know him very well. As the head of the classics department, he only taught upper-level classes. I wouldn't have my first class with him until the next semester. He had a reputation for executing long, rambling monologues in multiple languages and asking strings of rhetorical questions. If Dr. Reynolds was the dreamy professor, Dr. Savo was his doddering grandfather. "Come in, Miss Hart." The first thing I noticed when I opened the door was the office itself. A red brocade curtain draped from the ceiling to floor behind Dr. Savo's desk. The walls were invisible behind shelves piled with leather-bound tomes and plaster busts of ancient men. I recognized Emperor Claudius and Socrates. It was as if one of those paintings in the European wing of the Met had fallen off the wall and grown a third dimension. Then I saw the papers littering the desk. Pages from my application were strewn haphazardly across the polished granite surface. A few had even found their way to the floor. Have a seat, Miss Hart." "Yes, sir," I said, and sat down on the edge of an empty chair. I wrapped my hand around my folded notes and set both hands in my lap, crossed my legs at the ankles. The picture of a clean-cut, studious type, I hoped. "Cleo, Thessalonika, Hart," Dr. Savo said. "An unconventional name." He looked at me. "Yes, sir. My father's idea." This was good, I thought. I was already checking one of the boxes on my list. "My middle name is a tribute to his mother and her sister who emigrated from Greece. They were from Larissa in the Thessaloniki region." I paused. Something didn't feel right. Dr. Savo didn't break eye contact, didn't so much as nod in response. I cleared my throat. "My sister Helen's middle name is Larissa," I added. My voice wavered. I wouldn't be the next person to speak, I decided. Even if we just spent the entire half-hour staring at each other, at least his eyebrows were interesting. I'd never noticed how the gray hairs sprouted every which way before. "An unconventional name for an unconventional girl," he said. Normally, I'd be the first to agree with this kind of observation about me. I wasn't conventional. I would even go so far as to say I was exceptional. It wasn't the words themselves that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. It was the disapproval I heard in Dr. Savo's voice. "Sir?" "Tell me, Miss Hart, why do you want this fellowship?" "Well, as I wrote in my personal statement, No!" He held up a hand to silence me. Then he picked up the single sheet from his desk. "This personal statement explains why you are drawn to study the classics. Nothing here accounts for the fact that you are applying for a position that includes physical labor." "Oh, well, I am quite strong, quite capable. I grew up on a farm, and I'm on the sailing team. I'm amazed that you feel your pastoral background would be perceived as an asset in this situation. Likewise, fraternizing with the only co-ed club on campus is hardly a mark in your favor. So I'll ask you again, why do you want this fellowship?" "I just do," I said. "Reading ancient texts and learning about archaeology from books is fine, but—" "Fine, Miss Hart?" "I want to do it myself. Fieldwork, excavation. I don't just want it for the summer. I want it to be my career." "Your career?" He took the end of his glasses out of his mouth. I watched in horror as a string of spittle followed the earpiece to the desk onto a photo I'd taken at last year's theater department production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. The shiny liquid landed on the black and white image of Titania's flower crown. I looked back up at him. "Yes, my career." "Miss Hart, surely you are aware enough of the world to realize that you are one of only 5 female classics majors at Everly. And you are the only one of the 5 brazen enough to apply for the Pendlebury Fellowship." "But He held up his hand again. I stopped speaking. "To be an archaeologist is one kind of noble calling. To be a lady is a completely different kind of vocation. The two are not compatible in the slightest, and you, Miss Hart, seem destined to be neither." I tightened my fist around the folded square of notes I'd typed. They'd ended up being useless for anything except absorbing the sweat from my palm. "Good day, Miss Hart. I hope you use our discussion as an opportunity to examine your place in society with clarity and humility." I bit the inside of my cheek. The chair scratched on the floor as I stood up and walked to the door without saying another word.